You may have seen Extraction, which is a new Netflix movie on Netflix, because it's a Netflix movie, makes sense. But Extraction features Chris Hemsworth, and if you were someone who stuck around to the end of the movie, you may have some questions about what actually happened to the character, but more importantly, you may have seen the end credit sequence that featured this very watery reveal of the people from the movie, the credits. And what's really interesting is you don't have to spend a lot of money and go underwater to shoot a sequence like this. You can actually do it inside of Adobe After Effects. So that's what we are going to do right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new project, or a new sequence. We'll just click on this and we'll call it End Credits, and we'll just use the 1920 by 1080 preset that we have here, the HDTV. We'll do 24 frames, although it really doesn't matter which one you check. We'll do the 24 frames, and we'll set this to a 10-second duration just so that we can get an idea of how this is going to look. Hit OK. And the first thing that I want to do is create a new layer. The first thing, or a new solid, the first thing that I want to do is to kind of create this watery background. So let's call this a watercolor. Again, it doesn't matter what color we make it. We are going to make it the composition size, though. And to this, I want to, and we'll refer back to this particular shot multiple times. We know up here we have the top of the water. This is where the light is penetrating through, and we have those God rays that are coming through. But as water becomes more dense and more murky, it gets darker and darker and darker the further down you go. So at some point, we're going to need a color that's lighter on top and darker on the bottom. And the best way for us to do that is to probably apply a gradient ramp. So I'm just going to go over to my effects and presets, and I'm just going to type in gradient, maybe spell it right, gradient ramp. And here it is, gradient ramp, and I'm just going to apply it onto this layer. And we've used gradient ramp before for our start color, which is the dark color up here and light down here. We kind of want to reverse this, although it doesn't really matter. We're just going to go ahead and select a really dark green color here, maybe something like 23, 23, and 17, something like that. That looks pretty dark and grody. And then our dark color, our bottom color, let's do something like 2, 5, and 5. That kind of gives us this ramp from lighter at top, darker at the bottom. And as we work through this project, we will adjust this and make the bottom part even darker and the top part even lighter. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start working on the God rays. So in order to do that, we will create another new solid. And this one, let's just call it light rays. Make it the regular size. And to this, we're going to use one of my favorite effects of all time, fractal noise. Fractal noise is so versatile. You can use it for clouds. You can make curtains out of it. You can use fractal noise to create an oldie-timey effect on film. And you can use it to create the rays that we are going to create here. So if we look over here in our fractal noise control settings, the effect control settings, the basic and soft linear are such a good place to start, right? You could go in and use any of these others, but I think soft linear is a good place to start. One of the first things that I want to do, though, is I want to bump up this contrast, this area between light and dark, until we get something that maybe looks like that. And again, if we set this to 100, you can see that we have a nice set of gray, but I kind of want the darks to be darker and the lights to be a little bit lighter. I don't want to increase the brightness because that's going to actually undo the effect or counteract the effect that we're looking for. The next thing that I want to do is I want to change the size of this fractal noise. Now, the interesting thing about fractal noise is you can kind of think of it like a block of Swiss cheese, where, Swiss cheese has these bubbles in it. And these bubbles, when you cut through them, look like holes. But if you were to take a block of Swiss cheese and you were to slice it, just one thin slice after another, you would see a little tiny hole, then a little bigger hole, then a bigger hole, and then a bigger hole, and then it would start getting smaller and smaller and smaller again. Each one of those slices represents a cross section of that Swiss cheese hole. And that's kind of like what fractal noise is. We have this noise pattern, but the brighter areas, you could think of areas that are closer towards you, and the areas that get darker are areas that are further behind you or further away from you. So we could actually move through this fractal noise pattern. And if we were to create a solid object that would allow us to see all the thin slices, like if we could put like 100 different fractal noise patterns in a cube pattern, we would actually, and be able to offset them by, like 1 pixel, we would actually see a 3D representation of this fractal noise. It would kind of look like a cloud is what it would look like. So it's really kind of cool to see something like this. But one of the things that we can do is we can change the height and the width of this fractal noise. Now, by default, if we look here at the transform, it's set to uniform scaling, which means it's going to increase on both the X and the Y axis, which is what we don't want. So let's uncheck uniform scaling and let's lower the width quite a bit. Maybe something like that. You can see we're starting to get some kind of blurry, looks like something moving up and down that's very blurry. What happens if we increase this scale height? Now, this value only goes up to 600 here, but you can change it to something much higher, like 1700. And now we get these very thin lines. And that looks pretty cool. It kind of looks like, I don't know, a curtain. It kind of looks like a noisy pattern on the screen. Where fractal noise gets really interesting is when we animate the evolution. So as I start to drag this evolution dial, it's kind of like a rotation dial. As I start to drag this, notice how it looks like we are getting a very different look to the texture. It's animating. It's almost moving, like either something's moving through it, or there's a wind displacing it, or in the case of our water, like the currents are disrupting this light. So what I want to do is I want to animate this evolution. So I'm going to go ahead and at the beginning of my timeline, set a keyframe, and then I'm going to go down. I know we've got like a 10-second timeline, so we can easily just set a beginning and ending keyframe, and that's fine. But I want to show you something that how this evolution options work, this cycle evolution. I'm going to create another keyframe down at about 5 seconds in time, and I'm going to hit 1. And so what this does is over the course of 5 seconds, this is going to animate through one complete cycle, one complete evolution, and then it's going to return back to the beginning. Or it should return back to the beginning, and that's where the cycle evolution comes in. When I turn cycle evolution on, basically what it is saying is over the course of this time period between keyframe A and keyframe B, or keyframe 1 and keyframe 2, go through your entire evolution, but by the time you hit this second keyframe, you need to be back to the beginning keyframe. So if we were to jump back and forth between these two keyframes, they should be identical to one another. Okay. And so that's what cycle evolution does. Now, it's not going to continue to evolve past that second keyframe, but it is setting us up to where we can create a repeating keyframe with this cycle evolution. So the number of cycles means, hey, only do one cycle in between these two keyframes. If we turn this up to 5 cycles, that would mean that every second in this timeline would be exactly the same, and we'd have a very fast evolution. If we make a RAM preview, we get something that looks like that. Now, again, we're not at 100%. And of course, it stops right after we hit the end of that, and then it comes back and starts over again. Okay. I don't want it to cycle 5 times. I only want it to cycle once. I want this to be a relatively slow evolution. And then it hits back to the beginning and repeats. Now, One thing that I should point out is even though we set this second keyframe to one complete cycle, we really don't want it to be exactly right back to the beginning, or there will be a slight glitch or a little pause because we're going to have a duplicate frame here. So I'm going to actually set this to 359. So this second keyframe is going to be 0 and 359. And then this first keyframe, it's going to be all the way back to 1. And so we're going to get a slight change in this as we move from one to the other, this 360-degree evolution. Now, after we've got these two keyframes set, we've got our evolution set. The next thing that we need to do is make sure that this continues to repeat throughout the rest of the composition. And to do that, we already know how to do that. We're going to create an expression. We're going to hold down our Alt key or our Option key and click on that stopwatch to open up the expressions. So the expression we're going to use is property loop out. And we can just click anywhere to accept that. So what that does is, as we know, we've used this before, this expression says to basically loop all of the keyframes based on the last keyframe. So as we continue to move through here, we get a very kind of cool looping animation. So whether this is 10 seconds long, or whether this is 30 seconds long, or 2 minutes long, or however long we need it, we will get this constant looping of this animation. And if we decide that this animation is moving too slow or it's moving too fast, all we have to do then is just move this ending keyframe anywhere in our timeline, and it will ripple through the rest of the length of the composition. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so that is one thing. And if we make a RAM preview, you can see that we have a pretty good moving loop. All right, now we need to take this layer and we need to blend it with our colored background layer. So we're going to use a transfer mode. What transfer mode should we use? Well, if we use something like multiply, we start to get the look that we're looking for. But maybe, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe we'll come back to this. I'm going to use the classic color dodge. Now, this really gives us some bright highlights and some dark darks, and really is changing the color of everything through here. So this is going to be up to you, whether you want to use color dodge, classic color dodge. I really think multiply is maybe too muted for this project. Now, we're going to change this as we go through, but I really want the highlights to be bright. I really want it to make it look like there is light shining through the water. And so the light that does make it through the surface of the water is going to be very bright, but we don't want it this bright down here. So the other thing that we should probably do is turn down the opacity. I'm going to change the opacity to something like 45. That still gives us these very bright highlights. And it also gives us, you know, a little bit smoother blending, but I think 45 is probably a good place. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to blur this out. These rays look a little bit too sharp. So in order to blur this, I'm just going to apply a Gaussian blur. And I know that there are some obsolete versions of this. That's fine. You could use either one. I'm just going to drop the Gaussian blur onto this light rays layer, and I'm going to crank this blurriness up to 10 pixels. I do want to point out to you that up here in these edges, you'll start to see some banding. And for those of you that have used Gaussian blur before, you know that it tries its best to blur what's here at the edge, but there's really nothing there. So that's why you get this weird boxing around your Gaussian blur when it goes beyond the edge of the frame. So in order to fix that, we need to turn on repeat edge pixels, and that'll take care of that weird box effect that goes on. Okay, a couple of other things. Remember, the top of the screen needs to be brighter than the bottom of the screen, and an easy way to do that is to just use a mask on this layer. And I think what I want to do is just go ahead and double click with this light layers selected. If we double click the ellipse tool, it will create a mask that goes all the way around the edge and fits up the size of this frame. And then we can go to our selection tool and we can start to manipulate the size and shape of this mask. So remember, up here at the top, we want it to be a little bit wider, a little bit fatter, maybe something like this. Okay, that's probably a good place to start. And then, of course, we need to add some feathering to this mask. So with the mask selected, we can press the F key to bring up our feather. And let's crank up that feathering quite a bit. I don't know, 200 maybe might be a good place to start. We could even bring this up if we needed to. Something like that. Now we're starting to get that darker area. But as we saw in the original piece here, the light rays need to kind of come from a centralized point. They're not going to come straight down through here. So one easy way that we can do this, I mean, there's a million ways we could do this, but probably the easiest thing that we could do to this layer is to apply a corner pin effect. And the corner pin effect will allow us to take these points and kind of bring them together, something like this, and take these points and really move them out. Oops. So we can get that nice spread of light throughout the piece. And if we need to, we can bring these up higher and closer together. These don't have to be exact. So here we are now. Now we have some rays coming through this murkiness. And that looks pretty cool. I think we're getting there. That looks pretty neat now. Let's see if we can't get a few seconds of this to loop so we can kind of get an idea for speed, whether it looks natural or not. And this is all coming from the fractal noise effect with some Gaussian blur and some corner pinning going on. And so there we go. We've got these God rays coming down. We're not using a plugin. Now, there are some great plugins like Trapcode Shine would also be a really excellent way of generating these kind of rays. This is something that you can quickly do just with the base setting of Adobe After Effects. Now, even though we have some highlights, and I may want to bring that contrast down just a little bit more. We were at 100 now. Maybe I've decided I want to bring that down, maybe just below 100 now, just in the way that we have these transfer modes and everything being used. If we use multiply, see, now multiply really doesn't work. So we'll go back to the classic color dodge, or maybe just color dodge. Yeah, either one of those will work depending on how you want to go forward from this. I think the last thing that I would like to add onto this fractal noise layer, and let's just, we've already got this named light rays. I think I want to add a glow effect just to give this a little bit of glow. And again, a lot of different glow effects that you could use depending on what plugins you have. Trapcode Starglow is really cool. As you've seen in previous tutorials, I'm a big fan of deep glow, but I'm just going to apply the regular glow effect. And by default, this doesn't look pretty. It may not look the way that you want it, but let's bump this threshold up quite a bit to maybe 85%. And you can see, like, we get a little bit of a glow here, and some other bright areas are starting to glow. And then the glow radius, I'm also going to change to maybe like 30%. And maybe not 30%, 30 pixels. And just bump the glow intensity up. And we start to see these areas glowing. And as we cycle through here, you'll see other areas start to light up a little bit brighter than others. And again, you can do this to taste. What does Bob Ross say? He just says, do whatever you like. There's no such thing as right or wrong in this example. These are just your ways of being creative. So I do have a little problem if it gets too bright, but I think right now this is probably a good place to start. Okay, we do have some really nice particles going on here. Probably another thing that I want to do, I'm pretty satisfied with the way that these light rays are looking, and again, adjust however you want it. But I think I want to create some more depth in this shot. And an easy way that I can do that is just take this light rays layer and duplicate it. Now again, because these are exactly the same, that glow and that transfer mode and everything are going to layer on top of one another. But I want to create a section of very, very bright rays coming through, and then I want to create an overall diffuse look of rays coming through, or scattered rays. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this new layer that I've duplicated. Remember, Control D or Command D to duplicate the layer. I'm going to take that layer and I'm going to change its scaling. I don't know, let's go 250. And maybe move the position of this around a little bit. That is really a lot. Let's take that transparency and bring that way down. And maybe 250 may be too much. Maybe 220. And we may have to tweak on this second layer. We may have to take that corner pin and we may have to tweak those in a bit more because now we have some angles that don't match. I'm just going to take these and I'm just going to move them in a little bit more. We have something that kind of matches in this. And my position, let's just move this whole layer up a little bit more. Something like that. Now we have some very intense rays and some very diffuse rays that even get out here over to the edge. And the other thing that we can do, because remember, these two fractal patterns are exactly the same at the moment, so we are going to basically see them overlapping with one another. We can change this by going in to this second layer, okay? And in the fractal noise, we can increase that contrast, maybe like 125, maybe lower that brightness, maybe by about 10 points, 10 units. We can also increase the Gaussian blur quite a bit to maybe 30. See how that changes? So we were here, now we're here. It's just super subtle, but I think it gives it a little bit of extra oomph when we animate it. Now again, this is the same pattern, so probably the last thing that we could do down here for these evolution options is we have this item called random seed. Let's just pick, a different number completely. Let's pick a number like 200, and that will randomize the fractal pattern where it starts. And now we have two different layers interacting with one another. They're not exactly the same. We can just pick a different random pattern until we find one that we like. And again, this is all on you, so you can make this however you want. But now we're really starting to get the look that we're going for when we compare it to this. Now, granted, we've got a long way to go. We might want to lower the opacity and do some other things to this layer, but we are getting close to where this might be. If we go back and look at this other layer, you'll see that it looks like there's some cloudy stuff, not the little particles. We'll get to those in a moment. It looks like there's a bunch of cloudy stuff in this water as well. And we can create our own cloudy breakup of these light rays. We can do that even more by including another layer. Let me see. Maybe I want to go back to this layer one more time, because I think as I cycle through, I'm worried that some of these glows might be a little bit too hot. So maybe I'm going to take this glow threshold and bring that down quite a bit, increase the glow radius, and maybe bring that glow intensity down just a little bit. Okay, now I think we are ready for that next that next breakup pattern. So again, let's go up to Layer, New, Solid. Just make it black, doesn't matter. And we're going to add another fractal noise pattern. If you figured out ahead of time that we were going to add a fractal noise pattern because of how that other piece looked, then hey, good job. Good job on you. Let's increase this contrast by like 120. Let's increase the brightness. Now let's lower the brightness like by 45. Now we have this really crunchy black and white pattern that I think will work really, really well. Now the only other thing that we need to do is we need to go back and look at another transfer mode, which if you already said that, hey, congratulations. So which one shall we use? This time I do think multiply. Oh, maybe that's too much. Multiply I think would work. Let us lower the transparency though for this layer, the opacity for this layer. Let's bring it down to just like 10%, 15%, something like that. Now we have that broken up pattern that we saw before. If you want to go back in and say, oh, you know, color dodge looked pretty good before, you could use color dodge if you want, but I think here multiply is probably the one that we want to use, although you could use color burn. I don't see too much of the breakup pattern there. I think I'm going to leave it at multiply. And if you need to, you can adjust the opacity to your liking. You can make it higher or lower. That looks pretty good. If you want, I'm not going to do it, but you can take this fractal noise pattern and you could animate its evolution if you want. But I think at this point, if we just kind of make a RAM preview, that fractal noise pattern, because of the way the other two layers, the lightness of the other two layers are mixing with it, I think it gives us just enough of a smoky pattern that we don't have to animate it, unless you want. Okay, unless you want. You could certainly do that if you wanted to. I think that looks pretty good. I'm not going to worry about these really blown out areas just yet, because I think we can get to that here in just a moment. What river water, what other large bodies of water usually have is some kind of particles, some kind of particulate floating in that water. Now that could be from any number of things. We're not going to think too hard about it because then we just sit there and think gross and yuck. But in this case, we do need some little bits of something floating around in here. So let's jump back to a new solid, and we're going to call this one particles. And to this, we are going to use an effect called particle system. In fact, we're going to use the particle system 2. Again, another default plugin that comes with Adobe After Effects. I'm going to scrub down to about the 5-second mark just so we can see this in action. And because I want to make sure that we're only focusing on the particles, for the moment, I'm going to turn off all the other layers except for the watercolor layer so we can see how this all interacts. So Particle System 2 is a legit particle system that you can use in After Effects to create smoke, to create exhaust, to create laser beams, to create all sorts of things, rain, snow, whatever it may be. Most of the time when people look at it, they're confused by what this means. Why all of a sudden this looks to be something really hairy all over the screen. And a lot of that has to do with the physics engine that is part of the particle system. So one of the very first things that I want to do is let's go into the physics, and instead of explosive, which is kind of like a, you know, like an explosion, I want this to be directional. So I want this to come out in only one direction, up. And so for the direction, we do have that set to 1, so that means everything is going up. But it's emanating, if we scroll back, it all emanates from this one point. So if you really wanted to make an explosion, you could do something like that. The next thing that I want to do is, because we are in the water, is I don't want these particles to fall down. I want these particles to just kind of float around. And so to do that, I'm going to change the velocity to a very small number. Instead of 1, I'm going to change it to 0.1. So now these particles are flowing straight down. Let's fix this. Let's fix this direction just a little bit well, it's already going up in 1. What we can do is we can change the gravity. Now, in many particle systems, you will see different numbers representing the gravity of the world. In this example, I believe particle system 2 uses a gravity value of 1 to represent Earth's natural gravity. I believe in other systems, they actually use Earth's actual gravity, which I believe is like 8.9, whatever's. We're not going to do that here. Instead, I'm going to change the gravity to 0. And now we just have these particles kind of radiating outward and kind of floating in space. They don't really have a velocity because they're not going to shoot out very far. But we also see that there are a lot of particles, maybe more particles than we need at this point. So I'm going to change the birth rate down to 1. So now we have even fewer particles than we need. The other thing is we want the particles to cover the entire screen, not just this one little area. So the next thing that we can change is the producer. And the producer basically says, where are all of these particles coming from? We don't want it to be coming from the center of the screen. So again, we could just use these crosshairs and we could bring it down here to the bottom. And of course, that means we barely can see our particles. So for the moment, I'm just going to leave it, undo that and put it right back here so we can see what's going on. We also need to change the size of the emitter. The emitter right now is 3 pixels by 3 pixels, which means everything's coming out from a 3 by 3 point in space. We want these particles to fill the entire screen. So I'm going to really increase the radius of this on the X value. So if I crank this up to like 200, that'll fill the entire screen left to right on the X axis. And if we take this Y axis and we increase it this way, I don't know, let's make it also 200 just for the sake of argument. And now we take our producer position and we move it down here below the screen. Now when we play this, and it may be a little hard depending on the compression settings that you have, if we play through this, we now have these particles kind of moving around, popping in and out of place, but it fills the screen with some kind of grit that we have. Now we don't want little points, okay? A couple of things. These points are still moving very, very fast, and they're dying very, very quickly. So instead of living for only 2 seconds, I'm going to change the longevity to 10 seconds, which is the duration of our composition. And now we have, again, even with a birth rate of 1, we have a lot of particles in this layer. We'll fix that again in just a moment. The one thing that I don't want to happen is I don't want these particles to grow and appear over time. I want all these particles to kind of be on screen from the very first second of this animation. But the way this starts is it has to start from an origin point and it then has to grow into those number of particles. The easiest way to fix this is to go down here in our timeline, take this layer, click on it, and drag it to the left, and then grab the end point of the layer and drag it back all the way to the right. This way, at the very beginning of the timeline, these particles have already started prior to 0.0, so the screen is already filled with particles by the time we get to here. Okay, let's see if we can figure out a way to make these particles look a little better. I think we've already got our physics set. We've got our longevity set. We've got our birth rate set, which the birth rate may still be a little much. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's look at the particle type. Right now, these particles are set to little lines, and you can actually see them. They're actually just literally little lines. If we go at these different particle types, you can see we could have these as being stars, which, hey man, it's your project. We have shaded spheres. We have faded spheres. Well, kind of starting to look like what we might want. We have shaded and faded spheres. We have bubbles. Now, bubbles might be the way to go, although Having played around with it, this is not the one that I want because I don't want bubbles. I want particles, right? We also have motion polygons. We have quad polygons. Those kind of spin around like a bunch of confetti if you ever needed a confetti system. We have tetrahedrons. We have textured quad polygons. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we can do to these particles. And again, you can do whatever you want. You can pick whatever one of these you want, although we're trying to make it look somewhat realistic. I'm going to go back to the faded sphere, where it's got a solidness in its center, and then it fades out towards the edge, which is kind of what we want, because if you've ever seen particulates floating in the water, depending on your depth of field of your camera and everything, there's more than a good likely chance that the edge of these are going to be faded out. So now all we have to do is we have to work with how big do we want these to appear? What is their birth size? They're all going to change over time. And I'm going to set this super, super small, 0.01. Gives us these really tiny spheres, which could be far away in the distance. And then the depth size is how big these things are. How big do they grow over their lifespan? And even 0.75 seems pretty large. So I'm just going to change this to 0.1. So now we're starting to get these little dots here in our scene. Again, it may be, I don't know, you may want more of these, you may want less of these. I don't know at this point. I think that this works for me. We don't need a whole lot of them. There we go. Now we're starting to get something that looks like floating particulate in our water. And because of the randomness, because of the producer size, they're kind of going in all directions, being pulled left and right and up and down by the currents of the water. That's looking pretty good. Might still be too much. I'm going to just change this opacity to 30. And now that's really getting really small. But I do want to change the color of these things. I'm going to just have these all be a consistent color. Let me just turn off this background so we can kind of see. Oh, that's not going to work. Let's do birth to death. You know what? I think maybe I do want these to be a little bit bigger. Maybe I'm going to go to 0.1 to 0.15 just to get some bigger things floating in our water. This still may be too big. Let's do 0.05 to 0.1. I think that might be the size that I want. And now I'm going to change the color. I don't want this to be yellow and red. I'm going to actually just choose a kind of a very bright color. Well, bright in the sense that we're looking at this grayish color. And then the death color is going to be dark. Just a little bit darker, like 35. Oops, 35 and 35. So we've got a light gray to a dark gray. And again, we can change this transfer mode to a classic color dodge if we want. Or a color dodge, not color burn. There we go. So that as they float up here into the brighter areas of the screen, they start to light up more. And I may want to put these particles all the way down at the bottom just to see how this looks. So now we're starting to, in the brighter areas, get these particles. We don't want these to stand out a lot because there's already going to be enough going on in this scene. But if we just get the illusion of these little particles floating around the scene, starts to look a little bit more like stuff, and I say stuff, that we see floating around in the water. And if you don't believe this stuff exists because you only swim in a clean Clorox-filled swimming pool, go look at some video from under a lake surface or a pond surface, and you'll see all this stuff floating around all over the place. Okay, I think we're just about done. There's only one other thing at this point that I think we need to add into this composition, and that is some vignetting. We'll make the bottom a little darker, and we'll also make these edges a little darker. This is still a little bit too bright on the left and right corners. So the last thing that I'm going to do is one more layer, a new solid Let's call this one a vignette. Make it the comp size. And again, with the vignette layer selected, I'm just going to go up here to my ellipse tool. And again, if you don't have an ellipse tool, click and hold. If you're on the rectangle tool, go down and select ellipse tool. And if I just double click on that, it will create that circle that is the size of the layer. I'm going to go to my mask and I'm going to invert it. And then we're going to feather the heck out of it. So hit your F key to bring up the mask feather. And let us crank this way up. And we may want to, in addition to cranking that way up, we may want to look at the mask feather. So I'll hit M twice. We may want to look at the expansion a little bit, just to expand that out. Oh, now we're getting there. And if we need to, again, if we need to, you don't have to, but we could take this entire mask layer and maybe bring it up a little bit till we get something that looks like that. And there we have our water surface. And again, the more that we change this mask position, the higher up or the more constricting or the faster the fall off we can have on these light rays. So that's totally up to you. Also, another thing, if you think that those light rays are a little bit too much, you could go back to your watercolor layer, and the end of ramp right now is set to the bottom of the screen, but you could pull that up a little higher, but realize it's going to go fully dark down here. You could also adjust the mask position of the light rays. So for example, on this one, whoops, we could go to our second light rays layer and just move that whole thing up if we needed to. And you could also do that on the original light rays layer too, if you wanted to bring that mask up to kind of shrink those rays. You most certainly could, until you get something that you like. The final thing that we need to do in this piece is we just need to add our text. And if we're going to put in the star of our show, oops, we could put Hunky McHunkboat as the star of our piece. And this particular font that I'm using, whatever this is, Ostrich Sans Rounded, is all caps, so I don't have a way of changing this particular font size. So I'm just going to highlight that middle letter, and I'm just going to change that down to like maybe 60, maybe 75. And we can change the size of this, obviously, if we wanted to. Let's just grab the edges and make that bigger. Put it there in the middle of our screen. If we want to, you can also use a transfer mode on this one if you want. If you want to kind of mix it in. If you want to bring this on screen like you saw in the credits of the Extraction movie, you could go up to these animation presets and you could find an animation preset that will work for you. And then you could have this animated on. You could, instead of making this completely white, if you want this to be a little bit easier to read, but you don't want it blown out white. And really, you should never have any of your white at 100%. It should always be less than 100% for broadcast quality reasons. So we're going to just knock that down to maybe 80 by 80 by 80. It's still technically white, but it's not 100% pure white. There is the end credit sequence for your next water movie. Maybe you're making the next Ice Station Zero. Maybe you're making the next submarine movie. And someone is like, hey, we need an end credits, something that looks like we're underwater. There you go. There it is. And it's got everything that you need. It's got your floating particulate. It's got your murky depths. It's got your God rays coming down. Looks pretty good. If you have any questions, please let me know. But get out there and create something awesome. Thanks for watching.